Chapter 4. The Iron Law of Oligarchy and Organizational Structure. Robert Michels published Political Parties in 1911, which was translated into English in 1915. He also had personal and professional relationships with both Pareto and Mosca, which forms the actual, as well as theoretical, link between the three thinkers for them to be classed as the Italian school of elitism. He knew Pareto from his time in Paris and through correspondence about Georges Sorel, for whom they held a mutual admiration. Michels knew Mosca from his time in Turin, where he studied and taught in the first decade of the 1900s. In fact, Mosca seems to have taken Michels, 18 years his junior, under his wing, to the extent that he was described as a mentor-like figure to him. Michels has even been described straightforwardly as a Mosca's pupil, or Mosca's disciple. It is well known that Mosca and Pareto did not like each other. The chief source of the animosity is that Mosca believed he should have been recognized as the originator of the theory of elites, which Pareto did not acknowledge. Therefore, to come to be regarded by both as a kind of disciple was no mean feat. Michels found himself in a difficult position when he tried to give credit to both men, whom he liked and respected as intellectual mentors. Perhaps because he acknowledged his intellectual debts, Michels has often been seen as a considerable synthesizer of the ideas of others, and as the least original among the trio of neo-Machiavellians. In truth, originality is not and should not be seen as a criteria by which to judge elite theorists, but rather the degree to which their works describe reality. In any case, in putting forward a detailed mechanism through which his law operates, Michels does make an important advance on the work of Mosca and Pareto. In Political Parties, Robert Michels largely takes for granted the lessons of Mosca and Pareto, especially as they pertain to the impossibility of democracy. For the will of the people is not transferable, nor even the will of the single individual, argues Michels, drawing on Mosca directly. In actual fact, directly, the election is finished, the power of the mass over the delegate comes to an end. Hence not only is direct democracy impossible, but also representative democracy is necessarily a fiction. To represent, in this sense, comes to mean that the purely individual desire masquerades and is accepted as the will of the mass. The rank and file are manipulated into accepting policies with which they would not otherwise agree, and which are not in their interests, or at least are primarily in the interests of the leadership group. However, what is new in Michels is the fact that he applies this analysis not simply at the level of the state, but to all organizations, large families, totems, tribes, cities, nations, empires, churches, economic classes, clubs, parties, which are an altogether universal feature of human life. Since people invariably organize themselves into groups, and since none but the smallest groups are truly democratic in the sense of truly representing the interests of their members, organization implies a tendency to oligarchy. In every organization, whether it be a political party, a professional union, or any other association of any kind, the aristocratic tendency manifests itself very clearly. As a result of organization, every party or professional union becomes divided into a minority of directors and a majority of directed. Thus, one could gain institutional control simply by capturing the directorship of the organization. Change would flow top-down as against the individual wills of the disorganized majority. This is Michels's famous Iron Law of Oligarchy. Geraint Parry gives a succinct formulation of the law: in any organization of any size, leadership becomes necessary to its success and survival. The nature of organization is such that it gives power and advantages to the group of leaders who cannot then be checked or held accountable by their followers. Michels himself put it even more succinctly: who says organization, says oligarchy. What does Michels mean by organization, and what does he mean by oligarchy? C.W. Cassinelli was keen to strip the Iron Law of any ambiguity and so sought to define these terms more tightly. An organization is a group of human activities ordered by a system of specialization of function. A subgroup of these activities has as its goal the maintenance of this order or of an order very similar to it. He also defines oligarchy as follows: an oligarchy is an organization characterized by the fact that part of the activities of which it consists, viz., the activities having the highest degree of authority, which have been called leadership or executive activities, are free from control by any of the remainder of the organizational activities. This concept leads to a generalization which might be called a theory of irresponsible leadership. This does not mean that the leadership can simply ignore the mass. They must anticipate the reactions of the led, but rather that given the limitations of the raw materials with which they have to work, they have free rein to do whatever they want. Incidentally, the iron law of oligarchy explains, at a stroke, why the long march of the left through the institutions since 1945 in both America and across Europe has been so effective. They never needed to persuade most people in the populace or even at an organizational level of their view, they simply needed to capture the leadership positions to impose their will. The typical student at a university is not an activist, they are mostly disinterested, as Michel says of young trade union members, they are heedless, their thoughts run in erotic channels, they are always hoping some miracle will deliver them from the need of passing their whole lives as simple wage earners, but the leadership of the student union is not. In every university, therefore, the will of the student union leadership will prevail on campus. If that will is to enforce a quasi-Marxist progressive hegemony, then that will be the case too, on every campus. And so, we might see how society might wake up one day to find that it has sleepwalked into a quasi-Marxist progressive hegemony. The hard check on this is that the mass will not tolerate intrusive interventions into their everyday lives. Let us imagine the leadership of a student union sought to ban meat on campus in the name of their political agenda. In such circumstances, one might imagine a rapid and organized response from outraged students who do not wish to have vegetarianism imposed on them, and the student union would likely experience its own circulation of elites. However, the leadership would know this limitation and likely not push so far as to deprive themselves of power. In other words, if they are canny, the leaders will take what they can get away with and no more. There are a few features of Michel's analysis that should be stressed. He identifies 5 factors that prove his iron law, 2 psychological and 3 practical. Let us deal with the 2 psychological factors first. Much like Pareto, Michel's does not ignore psychology. In fact, he considers both the psychology of the masses and the leaders. As regards the former, in an analysis which chiefly seems to be derived from Gustave Le Bon, he notes the psychological need for leadership felt by the masses, their predisposition to hero worship, and their tendency to excessive gratitude. People en masse are subject to waves of emotion which spread like a contagious disease, and they are readily manipulated by leaders skilled in demagogy and knowledgeable in the workings of the collective psyche. As regards the psychology of the leaders, however, we get something approaching Lord Acton's maxim that absolute power corrupts absolutely. The consciousness of power always produces vanity, an undue belief in personal greatness. The desire to dominate, for good or for evil, is universal. These are elementary psychological facts. In the leader, the consciousness of his personal worth, and of the need which the mass feels for guidance, combine to induce in his mind a recognition of his own superiority, real or supposed, and awake, in addition, that spirit of command which exists in the germ of every man and woman. We see from this that every human power seeks to enlarge its prerogatives. He who has acquired power will almost always endeavor to consolidate it and to extend it, to multiply the ramparts which defend his position, and to withdraw himself from the control of the masses. Thus, once a leader has attained power in the first place, they are driven by something like a Nietzschean will to power, they are intoxicated by it and want more of it. It is significant that it is power that is the motivation and not merely money. All too often, naive analyses of elites imagine they are motivated by profits. This is almost never the case. The prospect of control is a far greater motivator than greed. Let us turn now to the 3 factors of practicality which ensure the iron law of oligarchy. The problem is not simply one of psychology, which is to say the selfishness of the leaders in pursuing their own interests instead of those of the masses, but also one of practical necessity. It is, as Samuel T. Francis might put it, a problem of mass and scale. Large, organizationally complex associations, compared with small, simple associations, for mechanical, technical and tactical reasons must succumb to the organizational, and therefore, the oligarchical principle. First, the mechanical reason is that, when dealing with organizations that number in the thousands, or even hundreds of thousands, or millions, you physically cannot get all the people in the same room at the same time. Even voting mechanisms are frustrated by the fact that, when dealing with that many people, you need to narrow their choices down to just a few of the most sensible suggestions. Even then, most people simply lack the time and interest to partake in constant referenda. From his time seeing the Social Democratic Party of Germany in practice, Michel saw that committees set up to organize the day-to-day running of the party were systematically unattended. Because of this, the democratic principle must give way to the oligarchical principle purely on mechanical grounds. However, let us pretend that there was a way, perhaps using modern technology and some crowdsourcing algorithm, to overcome the mechanical issue. There remains the technical one. There are innumerable bureaucratic details that must be seen to if the organization is to be kept alive. There are financial, administrative, diplomatic problems to be settled. A political party campaigning for power needs to organize its vote, canvass supporters, supply information for speakers, raise contributions, attend to the party's financial structure and its legal standing. It needs to establish a coordinated policy line for the sake of consistency and solidarity. However, there is yet a third reason that the organizational principle prevails, even beyond the technical requirements, which is tactical. The masses simply will not and cannot organize. At times, Michel seems to write as if the masses possess some pathological need to be led. For example, he writes, "The most striking proof of the organic weakness of the mass is furnished by the way in which, when deprived of the leaders in time of action, they abandon the field of battle in disordered flight. They seem to have no power of instinctive reorganization, and are useless until new captains arise capable of replacing those that have been lost. A crowd without organized leadership will simply devolve into a rabble." It is difficult not to think of the so-called storming of the Capitols on 6 January 2021. Donald Trump, having gathered his masses in Washington, D.C., simply abandoned them and they devolved to a disorganized mob with no direction or purpose. Once inside the Capitol building, all the individuals involved could think to do was inanely take pictures of themselves with their mobile phones. There was no plan, no coordination, no leadership. Michels would have predicted that it would have turned out as it did. And this is the tactical reason for the iron law. Since there is no escaping the iron law of oligarchy in any political party, power accrues to the bureaucrats who manage these things and tend to be concerned more with practical techniques than with principle. One might think of the power of political Svengalers such as Alastair Campbell in the British New Labour administration or, more recently, Dominic Cummings. Secondarily, power accrues to the elected representatives whose source of power lies outside the party itself in the voter base. We therefore see again the two strata of elites identified by Mosca and Pareto. We might call the former the bureaucracy of the party, the non-governing elite, and the latter, the actual politicians, the governing elite. Sometimes we might see someone with the skills of the former transition to becoming one of the latter, as was the case with Peter Mandelson when he became elected as an MP for Labour in 1992 after being there a director of communications. Still, Mandelson's skills as an organizer were utilized even once he became an MP. A testament to this fact is that even after having stepped down as an MP, in 2008 Prime Minister Gordon Brown so required Mandelson's technical skills that he made him a lord and brought him back into the cabinet. One of the consequences of this power that accrues to the leaders is that it manifests in what James Burnham called customary right. Formally, a new election for an office may be held every year or two. But, in practice, the mere fact that an individual has held the office in the past is thought by him and by the members to give him a moral claim on it for the future, or, if not on the same office, then on some other leadership post in the organization. It becomes almost unthinkable that those who have served the organization so well, or even not so well, in the past should be thrown aside. If the vagaries of elections by chance turn out wrong, then a niche is found in an embassy or bureau or post office, or, at the end, in the pension list. This is partly what Michels means when he says, power is always conservative. The interests of the leaders turn from any principled political stance they might have held to the business of maintaining positions of power, to become stable and irremovable. He points to the leadership of the supposedly anti-war, anti-patriotic Social Democratic Party of Germany magically becoming pro-war, and pro-patriotic on the eve of World War I. We might think of other, more recent, examples. In Britain, the Liberal Democrats under Nick Clegg campaigned to abolish university tuition fees only to form a coalition with the Conservatives. Then, as part of the coalition government, they raised tuition fees from £3,290 to £9,000 per year. While voters did not forget the betrayal, a study of the personal fortunes of Liberal Democrat leaders from that era would be instructive in proving Michels' point. Nick Clegg went on to be vice president for global affairs and communications of Facebook, Inc. Vince Cable became the new party leader before retiring. Menzies Campbell was made a lord. David Laws became the chief executive of the Education Policy Institute. Simon Hughes was knighted and made Chancellor of London South Bank University, along with at least 7 other senior advisory or directorial roles. British politicians have a remarkable capacity to fail upwards. These politicians may have been voted out of their seats, but they remained part of the ruling class and enlarged the scope of their personal power. The leaders of political parties maintain power, according to Michels, by virtue of the practicalities of organization. Hugo Droken summarizes what these are. There are 3 different resources that, according to Michels, ensure the leaders keep control of their party. These are as follows: A. Officials have superior knowledge, in that they are privy to much information that can be used to secure assent for their program. B. They control the formal means of communication, because they dominate the organization's press. Parties still had their own newspapers at the time, and as full-time salaried officials, they can travel from place to place presenting their case at the organization's expense, where their position enables them to command an audience, and C. They have skill in the art of politics, in that they are far more adept than non-professionals in making speeches, writing articles, and organizing group activities. Political leaders therefore enjoy an advantage in knowledge, communication methods, and political skills over the mass, in whom, as we have already seen, Michels considers all 3 resources to be totally lacking. This offers a great advance over Marxist analysis, which posits that leaders only enjoy their positions by virtue of ownership of the means of production. Michels is suggesting that it is the abilities of the leaders to organize through these 3 resources that justifies and maintains their position. This will become significant when we come to consider James Burnham's The Managerial Revolution, because in this are the seeds for the takeover of managers and bureaucrats. If organizational ability rather than land or business ownership is the criterion by which leaders are chosen, then it stands to reason that the managers would come to challenge and displace the power of the bourgeoisie, just as the bourgeoisie displaced the old aristocracies. However, in both Mosca and Michels, the role of the rich is somewhat hazy. It is certainly the case that wealth can be used to buy influence and power, but it is not clear whether the fact of ownership can trump the practical realities of organization. When Michels broaches this topic, he talks mainly about the extent to which old leaders are distrustful of and often unwilling to cede power to new upstarts, which frequently leads to censorship and a curbing of free speech. Again, it seems that organization is the decisive factor, even if wealth can grant certain advantages. Issues of wealth aside, the tactics of old leaders against young aspirants are interesting in and of themselves. Michels notes that the old leaders have many tactical advantages over the young aspirants, such as the fact that they have responsibilities of which the aspirants are free and therefore can always call them irresponsible. He also notes that the old leaders will style themselves as the sensible people, the adults in the room, against extremists, whom they can paint as naively idealist or as demagogues, and in this they can rely on the natural conservatism of the masses in the party membership, who distrust newcomers, to enlist support. They will then point to this support to enforce a discipline and subordination on the upstarts. In the early 2020s, one might think of the ancient leaders of the U.S. Democratic Party, such as Joe Biden, Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, and Elizabeth Warren, fending off young aspirants in Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Rashida Tlaib, Ayanna Pressley, and Ilhan Omar, collectively known as the Squad. The Democrat Old Guard have to date employed virtually every trick that Michels describes against the young aspirants. In this chapter, Michels adds a lot of color and detail to Pareto's circulation of elites. In Mosca and Pareto, the analysis is often zoomed out, at a level of remove, but in Michels, we see the human faces. This is because he is looking at smaller units of organization than the state, but let us not forget that the mass organization is merely a state in miniature. The value of Michels is in his many insights into practical, on-the-ground politics and the realities of organization. His chief contribution is to see that what Mosca and Pareto had said on the level of whole countries is also true at the level of large organizations. However, because his analysis is focused on individual organizations in microcosm, he does not give us, crucially, the relationships between organizations or how leaders in one organization respond to leaders in external organizations who are no direct threat to them. Is the tendency of elites in disparate organizations to diverge in rivalrous competition or to converge as people with largely similar interests and goals? Recall, for example, Nick Clegg leaving the Liberal Democrat Party to join Facebook. Are the interests of the Liberal Democrats and Facebook aligned or in competition? These questions would be left for James Burnham and Samuel T. Francis to flesh out, and we can return to them later. For now, I will say in passing that Mosca gives us the categories of feudals and bureaucratic with which to think about this problem on a state level. If large institutions in disparate fields, for example a political party and a corporation, become more rivalrous, it is a sign of feudalization, which is to say competing power centers. If they are on the opposite trajectory, towards convergence, we might say it is a sign of bureaucratization or even, in Mosca's phrase, over-bureaucratization. Michels provides a whole chapter himself on this topic called bureaucracy. Centralizing and decentralizing tendencies, but this offers no significant advance on Mosca and finds itself too bogged down in the minutiae of the contemporary German socialist scene of 1911. He does complain entertainingly, however, about the problem of bureaucratic specialization leading to mundane, career-seeking, obsequious men who know nothing of bigger ideas or principles. Bureaucratization suppresses individuality and gives to the society in which employees predominate a narrow petty bourgeois and philistine stamp. The bureaucratic spirit corrupts character and engenders moral poverty. Thus within bureaucratization is a degenerative principle, degenerative in the general quality of the personnel who form the non-governing elite, that could sow the seeds of a move towards decentralization by generating disaffected but more visionary types who agitate for change. We can see in this something of Pareto's circulation of elites. This also has the seed of an idea that would be dubbed a bio-Leninism by the blogger Spandrel in 2018, whereby these key bureaucratic roles are filled based more on loyalty to the party than for their actual skills. In Michels's terms, what is really happening is that they are weakening one of the key pillars on which the iron law depends, the practical abilities of the leaders to organize. If too many mundane specialists become toadying sycophants, then the advantage of the leaders is lost. The great strength of Michels's analysis, at the level of the organization, is that it is never monocausal. He always stresses both the psychological and practical factors, which combine to make his law iron. Much of the secondary scholarship on Michels seems irritated that his theory is not neater and confused by the fact that he calls it iron. It is iron because there is no escape from it. Even if you resolve the psychological factors, you would still have to deal with the practical factors and vice versa. They are also mutually reinforcing, which is to say that the practical factors compound the psychological factors and vice versa. The more a person stays in power, the more knowledge and practical skills they gain, the more they want to stay in power. By the same token, the more a person remains a mere plebeian, the less knowledge and experience of practical organization they gain, and the more reliant, both practically and psychologically, they become on the leaders. As we have seen, the law is iron also in the sense that the psychological factors are twofold, both the leaders and the masses. Even if you solved the problem of selfish leaders, you still have the problem of the helpless masses. The practical factors are even more robust, mechanical, technical, and tactical, underlined and maintained by the leaders' resources of knowledge, communication methods, and political skills. The mass thus must overcome at least 6 near insurmountable hurdles to overturn the iron law, which is practically impossible. The only method by which it is possible to displace the leadership within a party is to form a new leadership and outmaneuver the old one in these 6 categories, still no easy task since they have every motivation to stop you, but at least possible.